Oh, it's great to have your company. You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. My name is Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
You often hear that the church is dying in places like Britain and Europe and Australia, but thriving in other parts of the world, Africa, South America and so on. And our guest today has lived and experienced life in various countries in Latin America and as well as the US. Ruth Padilla DeBorst was born in Colombia to an Ecuadorian father and an American mother. And she grew up in Argentina. She is the Director of Christian Formation and Leadership Development with World Vision, and also a board member of Latin American Theological Fellowship. She lives in Costa Rica, where she shares the parenting of a blended multicultural family with her husband, James. She's visiting Australia with World Vision. Ruth, it's great to have you in. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, is that description of the church sort of fading away in the West but thriving elsewhere, is that reflected in your experience of living in various places?
Yes, definitely. Churches of all sorts, churches in garages and under trees and in big buildings and in smaller buildings. The church is growing in Latin America, definitely. And
when people are in poverty, I wonder whether faith is just a distraction, from their misery, or is it something more than that? What's going on there?
I think for some it could be. It is a way to dim the pain. But for many, faith is a whole lot more than that, and it drives them into action, into service, into involvement in all sorts of realms of life. Because of an understanding of that being the calling of Christians in the world.
I wonder if you could comment on the different shape of faith in places of abundant material wealth compared to places that are less so. You've lived in both.
Yeah, I think when we have too much, we trust too much in things and in what things can acquire for us, and we build our security on stuff. When we don't have, we have to really kind of reckon more with who we are as people and what it means to live as a community that can survive and make it and thrive and find ways forward. And understanding as Christians God's presence in the midst of those circumstances in some ways is more available because we're not as trusting in the stuff of our consumer society.
And I'm sure your own strength as well. You're not trusting in that, but in something else. So you mentioned that when faith is really vital for people in these circumstances, that it actually spurs their action to serve. So can you talk us through how the church in Latin America contributes to the common good?
Yes, I could tell you story after story of people who understand their faith to not be something only private or a Sunday thing or a churchy thing, but something that has to do with the way they live their lives and their priorities and their values. And so, for example, I could tell you of a group of women who, in sight of a current thing that happens in El Salvador, for example, is water is sold in plastic bags, small plastic bags that people can sip as they go on the bus. And people typically toss those bags into the street. And then the rains come, but the sewers are stopped up by bags. And so these women realized this problem and realized that really they, as believers in the Creator God, had to be responsible for what happened with their neighborhood. And so they began an entire recycling program that the city did not have, but the church began. 130,000 members start recycling. The city has to do something about it. And it became a model to other sister cities of just responsible citizen engagement with ecological concerns.
I think people today, especially in the West, feel really skeptical about the church and its relationship to power. Do they have good reason to feel skeptical?
I think so. I think too often when religion is associated to power, it blinds us to the needs of others. It becomes it self-legitimizes and doesn't really engage with the issues of the context, and so it's a harder challenge where you're divested from power Faith can empower, but with a very keen awareness of the needs and the issues of the context, so that you can be a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem.
And it is true to say, I'm sure, that the Christian faith has lots of resources when it comes to challenging injustice as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a Christian, I believe in the essence of being human and of God being involved in humanity is for just relations, for right relationships, for relationships that really do engender and support life rather than oppress and restrict.
Now, in Australia at the moment, we're in a rather torturous debate about asylum seekers. And I wanted to ask you about this. The issue raises questions around hospitality, fear of the other, and so on. And you've said in the past that God's love doesn't know any boundaries. Can you explain what you mean by that? And do you think that has anything to say to a culture like ours that's wrestling with this difficult problem?
Yeah, I think God is a God of open arms, and a God that, as we can read through Scripture, consistently encouraged God's people to open their arms. And the measure of their faith was the test of their faith wasn't how many times they prayed or how many services they attended or their religious festivities, but it was justice, and justice particularly to the most marginalized. That would mean widows, would mean orphans, and even strangers, foreigners, people from other lands. Even in some cases, they were called to have cities of refuge for criminal foreigners. That was pretty radical. And then you go through into the life of Jesus, and Jesus engages with people, even heals the son of one of the soldiers of the occupying army. So just this concern for the other, the openness to engage and welcome. And I think that is a challenge to any faith community today, is to say, are we being coherent with God's open arms?
Yeah, it's a challenge also. So as a church that exists, or people, as you say, the faith community existing in a very secular culture, though, it's a case of trying to persuade people of the benefit of this sort of approach to people, even if they don't share the same belief.
Right. So I guess the thing is, how do we affirm the value of everyone and the dignity? And of course, there are political implications to the decisions and such, and it's not a simple picture. So I'm not just writing it off as, it's just automatically you should welcome everyone. But there definitely needs to be a posture of acceptance and open arms.
You're really interested in healthy, thriving communities. What is there beyond economic questions that would indicate such, human flourishing? Because we often talk about, if we're rich, then we're happy. But surely there's more to a good life than that.
Definitely. I think reducing our well-being to economics is a pretty poor definition of well-being, because really what we most need in life are healthy relationships and that sustain, and then being able to build communities that together can find ways forward in spite of the circumstances. And so it actually there are plenty of studies that talk about how with poverty, under a certain line, you obviously are suffering a lot. But beyond covering your minimum needs, having more does not increase happiness. And I think it actually sometimes detracts from it because we trust in things rather than engaging with people.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. We're talking to Ruth Padilla DeBorst. I want to ask you about this idea of consumerism and the impact that it has on us, because of course it doesn't affect me or you, but I'm joking. Obviously, it's a terrible sort of disease.
It is. It is a pervasive value of our society that eats at us and consumes our very soul, I believe, because then we trust in what we have. We build up our image based on what we look like and what we own and how we dress, and then there's just an emptiness inside. And so I think for one, being aware of the needs of others, just linking in to see the way other people live can be a challenge to us, and say, well, what exactly is happening here if I have so much and most people have so little? But we need to be able to open our eyes and be receptive to the reality of injustice in our world, and that can start questioning our lifestyle and our priorities, and then I believe the call of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, as we believe in as Christians, does call us to engagement with others, and that in itself can be an antidote to this consuming consumption.
Consuming consumption. Yeah, absolutely. How about we talk about faith in the midst of suffering? Because when you talk about the Christian faith, it's life-affirming, it's good news. How does that good news sustain people even in such depressed circumstances?
Yes, I think there have been preachers and teachers and Christians have been known to often say, if something is going wrong, that's God's punishment and you deserve it. And we have an example of that in the Bible with Job's friends criticizing him. And that's not the God of the good news of Jesus Christ. It's a God that actually comes into people's suffering and accompanies people in their suffering, chooses to suffer along with. And so knowing that presence and being able to hold on to the confidence of that presence and of God's good purposes for all people, and that suffering is not something that is part of God's agenda to punish anybody. It is actually a result of injustice and our own greed and our own violence and distance from one another.
Ruth, I wonder whether that sense of God's presence in suffering has been reflected in your own experience in some way.
Yes. A few years ago, several years ago, 16 years ago, actually, my husband and children, we were filming, actually, a bushfire in Ecuador where we lived, and 3 people approached us armed and did a carjacking, and in the process they shot my husband, and it was a very dark night. And many people, as they've talked through with me and my grieving process and such, said, well, how can you still believe God is there with something so terrible happening to you and your children? And actually, I experienced at that moment, in the middle of that loss, the sense of God's presence sustaining, not just saying, I'm with you, compassionately, but I actually am suffering with you. And I think that's what the biblical image of Jesus on the cross is God taking on human suffering and giving us a chance for life beyond it. And that's what I've experienced, is life beyond that. That was 16 years ago. And it definitely is painful, but it also opened my eyes to the crazy world we live in, where our values are so distorted that these people feel they can, a car is more valuable than a life. But what happened to them that made them think that, and what happened to their families once they went to jail, and just to such a broken world. And it just opened my eyes to injustice and our distorted values, and began a whole new understanding of God's heart for justice in the midst of the messiness of life.
And Ruth, you sometimes hear people say that Christianity is mostly about securing a kind of ticket to the afterlife, as if it doesn't have a lot of impact on the present. In what way would you say that's not the picture of Christianity, and how you try to live that?
Right. Sadly, I think many people do portray it like that, but I don't think that's the good news we should claim. By God becoming a human being in Jesus, and walking the streets of a poor little relegated area of the world, God in a way legitimized history and said, it's good, I'm here, I'm in the midst of history, and we need to live in the midst of the day-to-day issues of our context. And so we're called to be that, to live as Jesus lived, and value people and the things Jesus valued, and be able to share the life that God has given us with others here today in the midst of all the messiness of life.
Lived out faith. It's a great challenge. Thanks for getting your wisdom on that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's good to be here.